right. Welcome everyone to our fall lecture series. My name is Katie Worthing. I'm the Executive Director at the Yarmouth History Center, and I'm glad to see you all here for our first lecture of the fall. Just a few points before I introduce our speaker. First off, we'd like to thank the Leon and Lisa Gorman for their support of our lecture series. Thank you also goes out to all of our members who help us put on programs like this and make sure we have a great slate of events throughout the year. We do have two talks coming up later this fall on October 11th at 7 o'clock. That's going to be in person at the History Center. We have Seth Goldstein joining us. He is the historian and director of the Cushing's Point Museum in South Portland. He'll be with us to speak about his recent research on the 19th century economic ties between Maine and the luxury producing plantations of the West Indies. Should be a great talk. That's October 11th in person. And then on October 18th, 7 o'clock on Zoom, we will hear from Rebecca White, who is a historian at the University of Maine at Augusta. She'll join us to speak about the history of women's clubs, including clubs like Yarmouth's Village Improvement Society and their lasting impact on local communities. Should be a great talk, timely because Yarmouth's Village Improvement Society is starting to go through some changes after 111 years. So really an interesting one. You can register for that talk right on our website. A couple of housekeeping items during the lecture. I request that you remain on mute so that we can have good audio quality for everyone. We'll close the talk with some time for Q&A. If you have a question during the talk, pop it into the chat box, or you're welcome to hold it until the end and pose it then. And now for tonight's speaker. We're pleased to welcome Candace Kanes tonight. She is a former newspaper reporter and editor, and now a historian. She likes libraries and dusty archives, doing research, writing about history and related topics. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism, a master's in American and Women's Studies, and a doctorate in American history. She's worked for newspapers in Ohio and Maine, taught history at several colleges in Maine, worked for a number of years as curator of the Maine Memory Network at Maine Historical Society, led numerous MHC book discussions, and curated a variety of museum exhibits. We are delighted to welcome you here tonight, Candace. Thank you.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to talk about, as you can see, politics, political parties, and Maine's newspaper history. I love using newspapers, especially old newspapers, for historical research, not just because I used to be a journalist, as I like to say, in the last century, but partly because newspapers often provide information that other sources don't. Things like gossip and social news, an early version of letters to the editor, even ads that can give a more complete view about a person, but also about a community and what life was like. Tonight, I'm going to focus mostly on newspaper history in the 19th century in Maine. Many of these newspapers, as you can probably see from the image that I have up on the screen, are challenging to read, even in digital format. Still, it's often worth plodding through long columns of gray type for interesting snippets. Also, there are some surprising, perhaps, aspects of 19th century newspapers that might help us think about media today and our relationship to the media and to historic newspapers. Maine's first newspaper, let me get this to work. The Falmouth Gazette and Weekly Advertiser began publishing in 1784 when the District of Maine was part of Massachusetts, 2 years before Portland was incorporated and 5 years before the US Constitution went into effect. The paper continued under a variety of names, owners, and publishers. In 1790, one of the Gazette's founders left that paper and started a rival newspaper, the Eastern Herald. So why did Portland need another newspaper? Because the new editor had different political views than did his former partner. There was only one political party at the time, the Federalists, but the two papers' views on issues differed nonetheless. Joseph Griffin, a sometime newspaper publisher, wrote a history of the press of Maine that he published in 1872. He said that Portland had a Republican club that started in 1794, and that by 1803, the Republican Party had become strong enough to support a newspaper, and the Eastern Argus was born. The first issue of the Argus, printed in the bottom right-hand corner, which you probably can't see on this image, but I'll show it to you in a minute, printed a letter about the paper's intention to take on the Federalists. Well, that's not going to show it to you, so. Okay, here we go. I've only included a small piece of the letter, but it shows the depth of passion about politics in 1803. It's addressed to the publishers of the paper and says, I understand you intend to advocate the government and constitution of our beloved country. If this be your intention and you think the following observations worthy of insertion, they are at your disposal. It is with parties as it is with individuals. If a man's practice does not correspond with his professions, we readily doubt his veracity. In like manner, if a party acts consistent with what they declare to be their sentiments, every prudent and unprejudiced citizen will withdraw his confidence and support. And then he goes on to say the party in our country, which still retains the name of Federalist, although they have long since abandoned the character, and it goes on. Griffin wrote that the Argus was born in, quote, violent times. The editor soon went to jail because of the freedom with which he uttered his sentiments. This was a great card for him. Week after week, he played his right bower with terrible effect upon his persecutors. The Argus would appear each week with its flaming leader headed 5th, 6th, or 7th, as it might be, of the imprisonment week of the imprisonment of the editor for daring to avow sentiments of political freedom. I haven't yet found copies of the issues with those headers, but I'm still looking. Griffin added, persecution for the free avowal of opinions in those days as now, remember he was writing in 1872, enlisted the people ardently in favor of the persecuted, and Willis lost nothing pecuniarily by making his bed in that hell of olden time, a county jail. Editors, Griffin also noted, carried weapons of defense such as crossbar or sheep's foot to repel assailants of the opposite political faith who they supposed to be lying in wait for them. Political parties continued to develop in the early republic, so there was more than one than just the Federalist. And most newspapers supported or were supported by particular parties. A brief aside here might help explain the often confusing names of political parties. The first party, the Federalists, was the party of George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans soon came along. That party split in 1824, and most members became Andrew Jackson Democrats. The rest became Whigs, who were opposed to Jackson's state rights populism, and the Whigs supported a strong federal government. It continues to get confusing. In fact, it gets even more confusing, so I'll stop there. Another Portland paper appeared, the Independent Statesman, in 1821. It was founded, Griffin said, to advocate the election of General Joshua Wingate for governor of the state in opposition to Albion K. Parris, which is interesting because both of those candidates were running as Democratic Republicans. But the new newspaper supported Wingate and the Argus supported Parris. Griffin added, the political contest that year was the most virulent and personal ever witnessed in this state, which isn't saying much since it was a brand new state. Parris was triumphantly elected governor. It's not clear why the new paper called itself Independent. Griffin called the Argus a Republican paper when he referred to its founding in 1803, but called it a Democratic paper in 1821, even though the party hadn't formally split by then. As I said, political parties can be kind of confusing in this era. There were many other Portland papers that came and went, changed names, editors, etc. In fact, between 1785, when the Falmouth Gazette started, and Maine statehood in 1820, there were 31 newspapers established in Maine, only 7 of which, according to Frederick Fassett, who wrote a 1932 master's thesis on the early history of Maine newspapers, only 7 continued after statehood. All were weekly papers, although a few experimented with publishing twice or occasionally 3 times a week. Some of those early papers were located in Hollowell, which became Augusta in 1799, Wiscasset, Castine, Machias, Albany in Oxford County, Newfield, and Freiburg. Besides representing political viewpoints, why were there so many newspapers and in very small communities? Probably because the United States was relatively new and people wanted news about the government and its doings. They also wanted news from Europe, where Britain and France were still fighting about all sorts of things. And until the early 19th century, many manufactured goods and other items originated in Europe, so shipping news and merchant news were important. In addition, the papers carried some local news and advertising, which was a really important source for local information. Most of the news was weeks or months old, as newspapers and letters usually arrived from Europe or elsewhere in the States by ship or horseback, but also could come directly from the mouths of travelers and be printed in the paper. Occasionally, newspapers started for reasons other than to support a particular political view, which doesn't mean they didn't support a particular political view. But one example is Joseph Griffin, the person who I've been quoting about newspaper history, wrote that a few weeks before he finished his apprenticeship as a printer in Massachusetts in 1819, he received a letter from Samuel P. Newman, a tutor and later professor at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, suggesting that Griffin set up shop. I don't know how Newman knew about him, but he suggested Griffin set up shop in Brunswick because the town needed a newspaper. He wrote that Bowdoin President Jesse Appleton concurred. So Griffin ended his apprenticeship. He bought a press and trays of type, because all type had to be hand set at that point, took a ship from Boston to Bath and a cart to Brunswick with his press and type, and soon opened a print shop. The population of Brunswick was about 3,000 at the time. Griffin ended up printing a lot of orations, sermons, catalogs, and other items for Bowdoin, and also did jobs for all kinds of other customers in the area. And in September 1820, he began a weekly newspaper. It only lasted about 6 months because he took on too much printing work and he couldn't publish a paper and do all the printing work. But he began another newspaper in Brunswick in 1831, in which he advocated against alcohol and the use of alcohol, the sale of alcohol, for the abolition of slavery, and for the end of the death penalty for crimes. But political parties and political viewpoints were the main driver of new papers. Many of the names of the papers reflected their close relationship to the parties or their attempts to be non-affiliated. There were the Bangor Daily Whig, the Bangor Independent, the Aroostook Democrat, the Bath Independent, the Maine Democrat, the Hollowell Free Soil Republican, the Farmer's Friend and Laboring Man's Advocate, the Lincoln Democrat, the Lincoln Republican, and the Democrat Clarion in Skowhegan that published under that name from 1841 to 1856, then became the Republican Clarion from 1857 to 1868 when it stopped publishing. A similar interesting story is that of the Waldo Democrat, which began publishing in Belfast in 1828 with an announcement that read, "The political character of this paper is to be, as its name purports, democratic, heartily and entirely democratic." In about a year, a new owner took over the paper, a man named William Henry Simpson, who had been raised a Whig, and when that party fell apart and he became a Democrat, he acquired the presses and type and called his paper the Republican Journal, which is odd since he was a Democrat. But the paper supported the Democratic Party until 1879, when Simpson announced support for the Republican Party and shifted the paper to support the Republicans. As a history of Belfast noted, this was a strange transformation, and the more so because a little later, the Progressive Age, which was a paper that had been founded in 1854 to support the Republican Party, the history then says, always a strong supporter of the doctrines assumed by the Journal, embraced those of the Greenback Party and soon became a full-fledged Democratic paper. It's really enough, I think, to make your head spin to try to figure all this out. And I'm sure it was for people reading them as the papers kept switching allegiance and changing their names sometimes to do so. Another intriguing story is that of the Oxford Democrat, which was founded in 1833. 20 years after it was founded, George Emery, a lawyer, became editor of the paper. While he was a Democrat, he didn't like the views of the pro-slavery faction of the party. This is in the 1850s, when this was a hot issue, and sought through paper to get the party to moderate those views, the party in Oxford County. That didn't go over well with some party members. And it was like this all throughout the state. Battles over slavery and other issues were causing trouble with the Democratic Party in many counties and communities. Interestingly, Emery's brother-in-law was Hannibal Hamlin, who had served in the Maine House and U.S. House and Senate. He too was a Democrat, but he opposed the expansion of slavery and supported abolition. In 1856, Hamlin switched to the Republican Party because of the Democratic Party's views on slavery. And as you probably know, Hamlin was also Lincoln's first vice president. So Emery changed the politics of the Oxford County Democrat to Republican while keeping the name of the paper, the Oxford County Democrat. A number of Republican editors followed when Emery decided to leave the newspaper business and return to lawyering, and Emery himself remained a Democrat. So naming a paper for a particular political leaning could have its problems, as the parties themselves often changed names and beliefs, as did the editors. These early newspapers, as you have seen, generally had no headlines as we know them. This paper has a few, but just labels of similar size type. Usually at least half of the paper was devoted to ads, including on the front page, as this one isn't very clear, but this is mostly ads on the front page. The front page also generally was national or international news, drawn from other newspapers and attributed to those papers usually, and sometimes more featurey items about literature or other topics, although generally not local, on the front page. It also sometimes included commentary on the news. Most of the newspapers were only 4 pages, and a few were 8. Local news was inside and included things like weddings, births, ship arrivals and departures, or notices of meetings or entertainments. And often on page 3 or 4, well, usually page 3 was mostly ads, but often on page 4, there were columns of poetry, or stories or other sort of human interest kinds of things. some local commentators submitted what we might now call letters to the editor to the paper, although they were generally longer than letters are today, and were signed with clever pseudonyms like Publius or a farmer. Sometimes these commentators carried on debates or disagreements with other commentators who also had pseudonyms, debates, disagreements, or supported their views. And sometimes those commentaries lasted through many issues of the newspaper. And I suspect that despite the use of all of these pseudonyms, the local people knew who the people were who were writing these comments. Besides the strictly party-affiliated papers in the, especially in the early and middle part of the 19th century, there were papers started by people in favor of causes or particular religious views. So there were temperance papers, there were anti-slavery papers. For instance, the Maine Anti-Slavery Society published for a number of years in the 1830s a paper called The Advocate of Freedom. And most of these papers had news broader than the cause they were advocating, but that cause was clear in the paper. There were papers like the Christian Intelligencer and Eastern Chronicle from in the 1820s, the Christian Mirror in 1822, and its editor was Asa Cummings, who had worked at Bowdoin and then became the pastor at the North Yarmouth Congregational Church. And he switched the Christian Mirror from what had been a more liberal Unitarian congregational paper to an evangelical or Orthodox congregational paper. There was a paper called the Bangor Journal of Literature, Science, Morals, and Religion, which you see here, that was published in 1837 and 38 or so. The Maine Baptist Herald in the 1820s, the Eastern Baptist from Brunswick in the 1830s, the Maine Free Will Baptist from Saco in the 1840s, the Maine Wesleyan Journal from Portland in the 1830s, among many others. There were just lots and lots of newspapers. And as I said, they did more than focus on only on their particular cause. A historian of American journalism calls the period from about 1800 to the mid 1830s the dark ages of partisan journalism, which you might see from the papers I showed you earlier. And he says that he thinks that arose from, that the reason it was sort of partisan and dark, that it arose from anxiety about big political changes that were happening at the time. So for instance, the capital of the US moved from Philadelphia to Washington in 1800, and people were anxious about what that would mean and, what might happen. Remember, this is, a relatively new country, and democracy was a grand experiment. Then Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1801, which brought a shift from Federalist rule to Republican Democrat rule, which also made people anxious about what would happen to the country. And the number of partisan newspapers increased, as did attacks on public figures, especially Jefferson. All of the change and anxiety, I guess, left people just really worried about where the country was headed. And it was, pretty young at that time. So he said, the historian said about this time that it surpassed all previous eras as far as scurrility and vulgar attack on personal character. Of course, he wrote his book in the 1940s and updated it through about 1960. So he didn't experience cable news, the internet, and other innovations that may have led him, if he were still around, to revise that statement or at least apply it to a different time period. So I think, using his idea about the anxiety about the new country, I think the large number of politically competing newspapers in Maine before statehood and perhaps the drop after Maine became a state could be related to anxiety about change in Maine. The District of Maine was quickly becoming more populous. There were arguments about land and all sorts of other things. And there were lots of discussions from the time of the Constitution being adopted about whether Maine should separate from Massachusetts. Now, I forgot to show you these few more of these specialty newspapers. So the Portland Weekly Advertiser, this is an issue from March 1786, has, and in the upper left-hand corner of the front page, this letter that's addressed to Mr. Printer. And it kind of supports, if you can read the whole letter, which goes on and on and on, it supports the argument about sort of anxiety about what's going to happen. He says, the writer, and I'm saying he because all of the writers were male at this point, much has been said in your papers of independence and a separate government in the province of Maine. The right of the one and the advantages of the other have been variously handled by a variety of writers upon the subject. Some have attempted to enforce the measure by urging the locality, the extent of those counties, and the benefit that would accrue to them by such a step, and others, equally sanguine that it would be greatly for their interest, go further and intimate that it is their right by the Constitution of Massachusetts. Some again say that it is a matter of intuition and consequently right or wrong. It must take effect. But others, less bold in their assertions, say we ought to have a separation, but we must ask for it. And I'll stop there because, like I said, it goes on and on and on. But you can see this was a really hot issue at the time, and it was debated not just in the newspapers, but as you probably know, there were lots of votes that were taken on whether Maine should separate from Massachusetts, and the sort of federalist coastal interests had different views than some of the interior parts of Maine interests. So by the 1830s, added to the other anxieties people might have had were the debates about slavery and anti-slavery, temperance, religion, splitting off of different religious sects, and lots of related issues. And as I said, I think, probably the number of newspapers dropped after Maine became a state because these issues about separation weren't as important anymore. Surprisingly, perhaps, there were also a few efforts at impartiality in newspapers. They're pretty brief, however. After the Eastern Herald and Gazette in Portland changed hands in 1797, the paper ran 4 campaign letters, all unsigned, with the explanation, "We have ever held it and will ever hold it as the duty of an editor of a newspaper to lay before the public the name of every candidate for any important office that may be presented, whose election is dependent on the voice of the people. To evince our impartiality, the following electioneering pieces sent to us by unknown correspondents are this day published." Frederick Fassett, who I mentioned earlier, included this example in his master's thesis in 1934 and commented, "Quite possibly, this actual impartiality in days when newspapers were expected to profess impartiality and practice the opposite contributed to the decline of the Herald and Gazette." So don't promise that you're going to be impartial and then actually be impartial, was the message. There was another short-lived exception to the partisanship of the era. In Ellsworth, the Radical was started in the late 1820s as a pro-Andrew Jackson paper, then became a Whig paper, probably in the mid-1820s, that is, as a pro-Andrew Jackson paper, then became a Whig paper in about 1836 when it was taken over by a Mr. Washburn. Joseph Griffin wrote, "For a few weeks only, Washburn started the novel idea of making his paper the advocate of both parties. One side of the paper being devoted to the interest of the Jackson party and the other equally zealous for the Adams party. A good authority says that Mr. Washburn's paper was an anti-Jackson paper. The paper soon changed hands. The experiment was not fully tested." As I've already mentioned, the slavery and the Civil War were really hot topics, starting ramping up in the 1830s and continuing through the war. And so most papers in Maine and everywhere took stands either supporting slavery in the South or for abolition or against the spread of slavery. It was such a heated issue that mobs destroyed or tried to destroy printing equipment or newspaper operations of papers whose opinions they didn't like. One example that you might know about that didn't happen in Maine, but is pretty well known, is that of Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, who is a native of Albion and a graduate of Waterville College. And Colby College holds a Lovejoy, gives a Lovejoy Award every year to somebody in the news business. Anyway, Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was a minister, and he published an anti-slavery newspaper in Alton, Illinois. He was shot and killed in 1837 by a pro-slavery mob that destroyed his printing press as well. But there is an example closer to home. Democrats in the Bangor area who opposed Lincoln and generally supported the South and slavery owned several newspapers. In this edition of the Democrat, which is a little hard to read, the top stories are Message of President Davis to the Confederate Congress and an Alabama Roman Catholic bishop on the war. It's dated August 6th, 1861, only months after the Civil War began. On August 12th, 6 days later, Unionists who disliked the Democrats' attack on the Union war effort broke up the paper's printing press and threw it out the window. The attack was planned and carried out by many men, and police and other officials who had been warned it was going to happen declined to take any action. The publisher, Marcellus Emery, recovered from the attack, however, and continued to print a paper. So how did ordinary citizens view and participate in this partisanship of newspapers and obviously in communities as well? I'm going to give you one example, which of course doesn't prove anything, but it's a great example. John Martin, who lived from 1823 to 1904, was a Bangor accountant and shopkeeper. He wrote and often illustrated a journal and 3 scrapbooks because he wanted his children to know what his life had been like. In the scrapbooks where Martin pasted newspaper clippings, he often added commentary to the articles he pasted in. For example, he covered most of one page with an account from the Bangor Evening Times and Bangor Daily Whig about the Union victory in Richmond. The multiple headlines that lead into the hour-by-hour account begin "Glorious News." In his remarks on the right-hand side of the page, which I know you can't read, but you can probably see the handwriting, Martin wrote, "The glad tidings that Richmond had gone up gave joy to every Union man in the North. The news came out on a bulletin at 12 noon and was in print at 3 in the Evening Times, and a general suspension of labor occurred the next morning when the accounts which I have here preserved came out in the Bangor Daily Whig. The Whig and Evening Times were under the same ownership. Obviously a Union man, Martin was not only thrilled with the news, he also was aware of the exact time the newspaper got word about Richmond and when it made it into print, and where to go to see the latest dispatches, the print shop's window. The newspaper was his, and no doubt many others' lifeline to information and views of events he cared deeply about. When Lee surrendered, Martin and many others in Bangor went wild. You might think that wasn't remarkable in a northern city and state that sent thousands of soldiers to the war, but as an upcoming lecture that Katie talked about is going to demonstrate, there were many economic interests of Maine and the South and that were linked. And so for that and other reasons, the war and the Republican policies sometimes weren't very popular in Maine. Martin wrote that the surrender news was received at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night and telegraphed to the newspaper. At daylight, a group of people with musical, and the people, even though the paper hadn't come out yet, people went to the office of the newspaper and saw the telegram in the window or something posted in the window that announced the news. At daylight, a group of people with musical instruments and a flag gathered. Martin wrote, they then marched to the Bangor Democrat office and were about to enter by violence when the mayor, Samuel H. Dale, requested them to not damage property so early in the day. It's one of my favorite of Martin's lines, that they shouldn't damage the property so early in the day, but apparently would be okay later. But if the inmates, meaning the employees of the business, did not put out the American flag, to put it out for them, whereupon a number of committee entered and requested the flag run out, to which they, the employees, demurred, and the committee run out the flag for them and made them promise to let it remain for the day. The crowd, or mob, then grew to about 400, Martin wrote. They stopped at all businesses known to be owned by secessionists and demanded that they put out the American flag and give 3 cheers to it. When the clerk at one business, whom Martin called an old secesh, declined, one of those trying to convince the business owner to do so was William H. Wheeler, the editor of the Bangor Daily Whig, a unionist publication. So the newspaper editor even got involved in this mob action. The crowd wanted to find Marcellus Emery, publisher of the Bangor Democrat, whose press had a few years earlier been thrown out the window. They went to the Franklin house where Emery boarded. Martin wrote that the mob called him out on the balcony and asked him to make a speech. He, Emery, thinking that the tar and feathers might not be a great distance off, complied with their wishes and addressed the company, saying he had been mistaken in many of his former editorials in the Bangor Daily Democrat, etc., and he was white as a sheet, and then withdrew. The company was about to march. Some of the crowd were not satisfied, so they halted and called him out a second time, made him take the flag and cheer it. This was a rare show, and everyone present enjoyed it to their full satisfaction. Later that day, a number of Bangor Unionists formed a citizens committee to go after those who hadn't supported the Union cause. It's so interesting that much of the focus of these Unionist residents of Bangor was on the newspapers, and the Southern supporters too was on the newspapers and which side they represented. So for the Unionists, they were sort of blaming the messenger by throwing the printing press out the window and going after the publisher of the paper, except that the messengers were as partisan as the receivers of the information were partisan for the other side. So that analogy doesn't quite work, but it's a real indication of how important the newspapers were to the communities, and how, people, I don't think Martin was the only one who knew exactly when they could go to the newspaper window and find out what the latest war news. Of course, wars bring out especially intense emotions, and the Civil War was perhaps an extreme example. With the advent of the telegraph, the news was received more quickly and more often, which added to the crowd's actions, as well as ramping up everybody's emotions on both sides. It was many years after the Civil War when newspapers became somewhat independent of political parties, although contentious politics certainly had not ended at that point. By the early 20th century, newspapers in Maine and elsewhere began to change in appearance and in purpose. The telegraph obviously added to papers' potential and usefulness, as did the railroad and eventually the typewriter, telephone, automobile, trucks, and airplanes. Linotype machines also, I didn't mention earlier, added to the speed with which newspapers could be put together. News and people who reported on the news could move more quickly with all of these new technologies. And so as a result, there was much more local news. In fact, in some of the earliest papers, there weren't exactly reporters. There were people who gathered news from various sources and put it in the paper, from various other printed sources or letters or so forth, and put it in the paper. But there weren't reporters who went to meetings and stuff very often. So with the advent of the 20th century, there was much more local news. Reporters went to events and covered government activities at all levels. There were lots more feature stories, photography and new printing technology. As I said, like the linotype machine helped. And the advent of radio and TV, when they came along, also changed newspapers, as they were competing sources for the kinds of information people sought. And they were able, in many cases, to be flexible enough to present breaking news, which newspapers couldn't do. And people no longer went to the windows of newspapers to find it. But newspapers also could provide more stories in more depth than the time constraints of radio and TV allowed, which helped the newspapers stay important for people. I'll leave the internet out of this discussion because its effect on newspapers is a little more complicated when the internet finally happened. And some of the changes, including the ease of printing papers and so forth, led to a lot of smaller locally based newspapers, like the one the Yarmouth Historical Society has digitized, and also led to fewer newspapers in some of the larger communities. So instead of having sometimes 3 or 4 papers, they often had just 2, one in the morning and one in the evening. But it also led to a wider availability of newspapers from other locales. So the goal of most newspapers, and newspapers in other languages, by the way. So the goal of most newspapers in Maine through much of the 20th century became presenting news with less bias and keeping particular political views of the newspaper's owners and editors on an editorial page labeled as opinion. Although, as you can see from the paper on the left, that was less likely to be the case during some wars. And interestingly, during World War I, the government passed Alien and Sedition Acts, and it was newspapers could be charged with sedition for printing any questioning of the war. So as you can see from this issue of the Brunswick Record, very enthusiastic about the war effort. But as longtime Maine resident E.B. White wrote in the New Yorker in 1956, all writing slants the way a writer leans, and no man is born perpendicular, though many are born upright. So I'll stop for there, except to say that if you'd like to explore more newspapers in Maine, here are two among many sources of ways to do that. You probably already have the link to the newly digitized Yarmouth shopping notes. And the other one is the Maine Newspaper Project that, with the support of the Library of Congress, has digitized many newspapers in Maine. And if you go to this website, you'll see a whole list of them. The only ones you can see here are Androscoggin and Aroostook counties. And many of my images came from these listings. There are also lots of libraries that host digitized versions of local papers. So there are plenty of opportunities for researcher just reading and exploring and enjoying old newspapers. So I'm happy to answer questions or hear your comments.
Thanks so much, Candace. That was great.
You're welcome.
I'll open it up to questions. If folks have them, feel free to ask. I can't see everyone on my screen just now, so feel free to just dive in if you've got a question. Yeah, I see Bill's hand. Go ahead. You're on mute.
Okay, is it possible to group papers based on ones that tended to persist over decades versus those that seem to be the individual project or the project of an individual who might have a shorter run based on how long that person was enthusiastic about it? I know it, there's a lot of people who say, let's put out a newsletter. And boy, after a while, the newsletter feels like a kind of a millstone around your neck. You start out writing, I got a great idea, and then I got a great idea for the second week. And the third week, well, it's a little harder, or maybe the third year. But it's not easy to pull these things together.
No, absolutely. There are definitely a few newspapers that lasted a long time. And many of the papers, including a lot of the ones I've shown, were relatively short-lived. And I don't think it was really as much the difficulty of putting the paper out as there are ties to political parties. And when the party changed or died, so did the newspaper. And also the economics of it, it was harder to support 5 newspapers in one community. And some of these really small communities had competing papers. But yeah, there are a lot of newspapers that didn't last very long.
Was there a central place for the production of the paper, that the copy was sent to one of the larger towns and then shipped back by rail after, say, 1850? You had pretty good rail connections, and it might have been easier to send your copy out and have it come back printed already for you.
Yeah, not that I know of. Most of the early newspapers and a lot of newspapers today still had their own print shops, because you can act faster if you have your own print shop. You can change things at the last minute and so forth.
And if you have a 4-page broadsheet, you can put it together pretty quickly.
Once linotypes came along, you could. Hand setting type took a little longer. I think 1880s was when linotype came along. But I do agree with you that some people just got tired of it. I mean, I think that's what happened to Emory and the Oxford Democrat. He was really a lawyer, and I think he just had it trying to not come up with news, but fighting the battles that he had to fight.
Hmm.
Got a great question in the chat box from Alan, who says, poetry seems to be a big part of the early papers. Can you speak to that?
You know, I don't really know why, but I've noticed that most of the papers have, like I said, usually on page 4, poetry or a short story of some kind. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think there definitely was an interest in literature because often the front page had reference to some literary thing, although it usually wasn't local. The back page wasn't necessarily local either, but I really don't know why. I haven't really looked into it or read anything about it. Do you have any thoughts about it?
I haven't thought very much about it, and I'm not the person who wrote that comment, but life was so different 150 or 175 years ago. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century, where particularly in a smaller town, uh, where you didn't have maybe a theater or a place for concerts and so on as frequently, people had a lot of time on their hands after dark. And
That's,
and I would think it would be common that people would try their hand at writing poetry, and finally, having perfected it after 6 weeks, whoever they're living with, their mother, father, spouse, says, "Why don't you send it into the paper?" And one
that's where
person
most of
does
it
it,
was
then someone else
newspapers.
says, "I want to do that." I think the world was really different in many respects, and people made a lot of good use of their time, writing poetry, reading a lot of books, doing a lot of maybe even longer analysis, or trying to write articles that they would send to, I don't know, Saturday Evening Post or earlier journals of some sort. I haven't got my head inside the minds of people of 150 years ago, and I'd love to have go back in time and be a fly on the wall.
Well, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was one of the best known people in the United States in the 19th
Yeah.
century because of his poetry. And people then, as I think it probably continues, knew his poems, memorized his poems. So I think you're right. I mean, it's partly life was different. People weren't looking at their cell phones all the time. They were doing other things. So, but poetry was very popular. So.
The reason I asked the question, if I'm not interrupting,
Oh, thank you.
was I'm doing some research on a Phoebe Dole here in Wyndham, and she started by writing poetry for the different papers in Portland. And excuse me, and they were put in the papers, and then she ended up as the editor of the Gorham Gazette, and that seems to be the progression that it took. And following her, she ended up being one of Maine's noted poets of that time era. And thank you for answering the question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Another value of newspapers.
So I wonder, how much of your research have you been able to do online, or are you still able to dive into some, actual newspaper collections at various libraries and historical societies?
Most of it these days I've done online, but there aren't very many places where you can actually use the original newspaper because they're so fragile. But a lot of them were microfilmed. So the ones that aren't, I mean, I have looked at some original papers too, but I've also spent, I can't tell you how many hours over how many years using microfilm newspapers, which if you've used microfilm readers, it's a real joy to try to use them. I mean, the advantage, of course, of the digital ones is not just that they're more accessible, but that depending on how they're digitized, many of them are searchable. So you don't have to go through and read every column of every page of type, although I kind of enjoy doing that because you find things you wouldn't find otherwise. But yeah, mostly these days, digital or microfilm.
Do you have a favorite find? That's a question I hate getting, so I apologize for posing it to you, but I am curious.
Well, I've been doing a lot of research over the years about formerly enslaved people who came to Maine, usually through the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau or with a soldier after the Civil War. And so, most of those people couldn't read or write, so they didn't have things that they left that I can read about them, but the newspapers often were interested in them. And so I found some really amazing things about these people who were transported having no idea really what they were getting into from the South to usually rural Maine. And so there have been some really, really great pieces in there, including that I found from the newspapers, including a piece about a man in Lewiston who he and some other people were brought there through the Freedmen's Bureau by Alonzo Garcelon, who was Maine Surgeon General during the Civil War and one of the founders of the Lewiston Evening Journal, which is one of my favorite papers to read. But anyway, they wrote a lot of stories about this guy. So, from the point of view, it wasn't his words, but from the point of view of the newspaper, I could learn a lot about him. So that, and others in there. And one of the reasons I like the Lewiston Evening Journal so much is they ran over the years, lots of feature stories, which are really wonderful sources of information. Anyway, they called this man the politest man in Lewiston.
Wow, thank
Which
you.
have a lot of meanings. So,
So maybe one more question. I see Art's hand up.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very, very fascinating. First of all, I want to say, as a proud alumnus of Colby College, thank you for the shout out for Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. That he's a hero to all of us who are Colby alumni. My question, though, is in today's world, if you can, look at your research and project it onto today's world, what role does the media play in our political world today? You obviously showed us through history how the different presses and newspapers had strong political footings. But in today's world, how do you see the role of newspapers and the media, I guess, because newspapers seem to be less and less irrelevant, but the modern media influencing our democracy, I guess?
I think it's huge. I mean, I do rant about it a lot. You probably don't want to hear me do that tonight, but I think the in part, which is why I wasn't going to talk about the internet, but in part because of the immediacy. Well, let me step back a minute and tell you, there used to be a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which said that, like, if a TV station interviewed one candidate, they had to also give equal time to the other one, things like that. Well, when cable news came along, I think this change came sometime in the late 70s. When cable news came along, and so there were so many more options for presenting news, the FCC did away with the fairness doctrine because they figured there's all these sources, so we don't have to regulate it to make sure that people get, you know, an equal voice. They can get it from a different station or whatever. And, you know, I think that proliferation from cable, first from cable and then the internet, has just opened up, you know, what we even think of as the media and who might be presenting news. And, you know, not everybody, you know, went to journalism school or whatever and had beat into them, you know, you have to be fair and you have to do this. So it's become, you know, I think the media, which is one reason I think these 19th century newspapers are 18th and 19th century papers are so interesting, because in a sense they were doing what I think is happening now, that the certain papers or certain parts of the media become attached, you know, to one idea. And there still exists what E.B. White might have called the man who was born upright, but I think it's less and less important to a lot of parts of the media.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think we'll close there. Thank you so much, Candace, for your time and expertise this evening. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.